Now, as I mentioned, important meeting today. Colombia's president and Trump, they have traded insults, they've dealt with tariffs, sanctions, but now trying to forge better relations, apparently, in part by Petro trying to convince Trump that he has Colombia's drug smuggling under control. Your thoughts on that meeting and the impact that it could have moving forward?
Well, we'll see. It's a very difficult situation, and there are elections coming up in Colombia in a few months. And Trump and also Marco Rubio have been very critical of the current left-wing government of President Gustavo Petro. And there have been allegations that the U.S. has also been meddling inside of Colombia's election, like Trump also meddled in Argentina's recent election. So we'll see. I think Petro is also very concerned about the possibility of further U.S. escalation. You know, not only has the U.S., of course, abducted President Maduro of Venezuela and attacked Venezuela, Trump is now putting a naval blockade essentially on Cuba. But let's not forget that, furthermore, in terms of Colombia, Trump put sanctions personally on Gustavo Petro, which was an extraordinary act of putting sanctions on a sitting president. So, you know, Colombia is trying the best it can to stabilize relations.
And it's also interesting because since the Trump administration announced that it will be running Venezuela, apparently Petro and Trump today talked about possibly exporting Venezuelan oil through Colombia. Certainly that is a way to get on the good side of Donald Trump.
Yeah, certainly. And right now, the Venezuelan and Colombian governments actually do have quite good relations. Historically, they had been rivals. But, you know, the Venezuelan leadership right now is being very pragmatic and simply trying to find a way to stabilize relations with the U.S. and try to reduce U.S. sanctions on Venezuela. So if Colombia could help play this role, Gustavo Petro could help to play this role to reduce U.S. sanctions on Venezuela and find a way to help Venezuela sell its oil, I think that would be welcomed in Caracas.
Yeah, give us a sense about how these punishing sanctions have affected Caracas, Venezuela. What is day-to-day life like in Venezuela a month after the U.S. took Maduro into custody?
Well, in the past few years, the economy has stabilized quite a bit. I mean, I remember being in Venezuela. I've gone several times, but I remember especially in 2019 when, you know, Trump imposed a full-on embargo on Venezuela, and the inflation was the highest I've ever seen in my life. It was absolutely crazy hyperinflation. Since then, the economy has stabilized more, but there still are major economic difficulties because the reality is that Venezuela has been a petrostate for 100 years. This is nothing new. Its economy is similar to a country like Saudi Arabia. And the sanctions, in fact, on Venezuela go back even before Trump. They go back to Obama in 2015. But during his first term as president, Trump imposed very heavy sanctions on Venezuela and then a full-on economic embargo. This devastated the country because, one, it made it very difficult for Venezuela to trade, to be involved in international trade and to sell its oil. But furthermore, because Venezuela's oil industry was built up largely using parts and technology and capital equipment from U.S. companies, the sanctions made it very difficult for Venezuela to maintain its oil infrastructure, to repair broken infrastructure, and this led to a significant fall in oil output. So the current leadership of acting President Delcy Rodriguez, her strategy is she's making these, you know, concessions to the U.S. and allowing more private investment and reducing the tax rates and reducing the share of ownership by Venezuela's state-owned oil company, PDVSA. And her strategy is she's trying to bring in this private investment in order for the U.S. to lift some of these sanctions so Venezuela can rebuild its oil industry and try to increase output. Right now, Venezuela produces about 1 million barrels per day. But before the sanctions, Venezuela was producing about 2.5 million barrels per day. So Venezuela is trying to balance its relationship. It's a very complicated balancing act, but they're trying to increase oil output in order to reinvigorate the economy.
It's interesting. I want to talk more about Delcy Rodriguez and the position that she is in, because right after Maduro was taken into custody, she came out and said Maduro needs to come back to Venezuela. What has been her position since then? And really, what kind of leadership role does she have at this point? Does she have immediate plans? Will there possibly be a free election in Venezuela?
Well, Delcy has made it clear that she does still support President Maduro. After all, she was President Maduro's vice president. And people have to understand that Delcy comes from a longtime activist family. Her father, in fact, was a left-wing revolutionary in an armed group, and he was tortured and killed by a previous right-wing government in Venezuela. So she comes, from this left-wing tradition. But at the same time, she also is very pragmatic, and she understands that she had to make some kind of deal with the U.S. Otherwise, the U.S. could potentially attack again and potentially kidnap her. And there have been reports, for instance, in Reuters, that the Trump administration is threatening her and other top leaders in Venezuela, such as the Interior Minister, Diosdado Cabello. So, like I said, she's playing a very complicated balancing act here. What she's trying to do is make concessions to the U.S. in order to get some of the sanctions lifted, to have, the boot off of the neck of Venezuela,
Sure.
Venezuela's neck, in order to rebuild the oil industry, in order to reinvigorate the economy after Venezuela has dealt with, such high inflation for these years. At the same time, Delcy understands that her domestic reputation, and especially among the Chavista base of her Socialist Party, her reputation depends on also maintaining an independent policy. So she's been trying to balance this with still reaffirming support for the legacy of Hugo Chavez and still calling for the freedom of President Maduro. And at the same time, Delcy has actually publicly criticized the U.S. for trying to control Venezuela.
Absolutely.
So she's not just completely giving in. Like I said, this is a very complicated balancing act. And, we see some hawks in the Trump camp, like, for instance, Marco Rubio and some of the forces in Miami, who are calling for further attacks on Venezuela. So it's very difficult to know, to your question about what would happen in a few years from now.
Right.
It's very difficult to know. According to the Venezuelan constitution, Delcy Rodriguez is the acting president because she has a mandate as the vice president. So in a few months or in a few years from now, what will the situation look like? It's very hard to say. But I will say that in Venezuela, I've heard from a lot of people that they're frightened of the possibility of another U.S. attack.